Hello. Today I want to talk about Financial Statement Designer. Have you ever had a situation in financial statements when you needed to reduce the size of the font or change the font on your financial statement? And so you go into Design, and you go to Design Options, and you go down to the default font, and you change it to be the default font. So in this case, my default font is going to be Arial Regular 12, or 11, sorry. We could maybe change it to 12 and see what happens. And it tells me that it's going to adjust a few things based on the new font. And there might be a couple things that changed, but basically these weird fonts that I have, or the sizing of certain sections of the statement don't change while others do. Obviously, the example that you see in front of you is an extreme example of how we can have different fonts in different sections. I was just goofing around for demonstration purposes today. But the gist of what I was saying is that I went into Design Options, changed my default font. In my case, I increased the size. And I still have all this weirdness going on my design. Well, the thing we have to realize now about financial statements and fonts is that different font settings take precedent over others. And in trying to figure out how that worked, I've come up with a fairly simple rule of thumb that I wanted to share with you. And my rule is that rows rule. Basically, a financial statement design is nothing but a spreadsheet, a little bit different looking, but nothing but a spreadsheet that's made up of rows and columns. So our rows would be things like our amount options. So if I double click on my line, my row, I have my amount option setting. I could have a row that is just text. So I've got my current assets title, long-term asset title, current liability title. Those are all just text fields. I could be on my text field and go to under Design Instruction Options, and I have a font setting on my text. Another row that I might have are my totals. So if I double-click on a total line or total row, again, I have font settings, and in this case I can get even more specific. I have a font setting for the title of the total, and I have a font setting for the actual numbers in the columns. Okay, so my rule is that the rows rule. So the settings in the fonts on the different options that make up the rows are going to take precedent or are going to overrule any other settings that you have for fonts in your statement design. So if I need to change something, because I see I've got things all different, for example, on my long-term assets line, my total, I can double-click here. I can come into my title font. I can change it to whatever I need it to be, or for our purposes today, I will just change it to my default font. I can also go down to my total font for the amounts, and again, I can select my default font. All right. Now, what I might also be seeing, though, is this font here doesn't really look like an Arial font. It says it is, but it's not. It hasn't changed yet. And that's because the next font setting that comes into play after I've corrected my lines or my rows is the column settings. So if I look at my current balance column, for example, and I look at my font settings on my columns, again, I have the ability to have one font on my heading, which is my default font. It's my Arial Regular 12. Okay. But I have a different font setting for the information that's contained in that column. So you can see I have a different one here. I'll change that to my default font. It resizes based on the size of the font that I've chosen and changes it to be the default font. So if I look at my account name title over here and go into that column option, I can see that I have a font changed from the default. You can always identify it by the little stars beside the name. So this is still different, and I'll make that be the default as well. Last but not least, once I've corrected my rows, the settings on my rows, once I've corrected my settings on my columns, then I could go ahead and change the entire design based on going to Design, Design Options, and changing my font in my default area. So before you drive yourself crazy and think that you are getting fooled by fonts, think back to this article and this information and realize that rows rule, columns come second, and then you can go to your default overall font. Hope it helps. Thanks.